Book of Lamentations is a book of beautiful poetry that I felt needed a place in this course. Tradition has always maintained that Jeremiah was the author of Lamentations, and in 2 Chronicles 35:25, it does say that Jeremiah wrote a lament for Josiah. Um, the Septuagint adds a preface to the Book of Lamentations that says that this book was associated with Jeremiah. And Christian canonical placement of this book would associate it with Jeremiah. It comes right after the book of Jeremiah, which would seem to indicate that there was some belief that Jeremiah wrote it. The truth is that there are some reasons to think Jeremiah wasn't the author of this text. The laments of this book are for Jerusalem and Judah. They're never specifically mentioned for Josiah. That Second Chronicles passage probably doesn't refer to the book of Lamentations. There are differences in tone and in style between Lamentations and Jeremiah. And so for that reason, I never want to overstate these things. I would rather say, we can probably say the author was someone who experienced the fall of Jerusalem in 587, but we don't want to go too far by picking out a name on that one. I just think it's someone who lived through that difficult time. The book is 5 chapters, 5 individual laments, probably written down soon after the destruction. Some suggest that the 5th lament, the 5th chapter, was written even later than the first 4, and that's possible. They are The first 4 are 4 different acrostics. We talked about acrostics when we talked about Hebrew poetry. The first 4 are all acrostics. Chapters 1 and 2 all represent successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The 3rd lament, which is kind of interesting, in chapter 3, has 3 lines with each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So 3 alepphs, 3 beits, 3 gimels, 3 daleths. Perhaps the most curious thing of all, though, I mean, so you have 22, 22, 66, 22, and then you have the last chapter, which is 22 verses, which if you're reading in English, your immediate thought would be, oh, 22 verses. It's probably an acrostic. And it's not. The last chapter of the Book of Lamentations is 22 verses like an acrostic, but it's not an acrostic. It's just the simple parallelisms as you go through it, which is, of course, speculated all sorts of reasons as to why. Is that intentional? Is that accidental? Someone say that heard a scholar suggest that the book wasn't finished yet. He was going to make it an acrostic, but he just didn't get around to it. I don't tend to go that way. But it is at least a curious feature of this, that you have these ordered acrostics in the first 4 chapters, and then the 5th one is not. It's just basic poetry. The grief that comes in this book is just pure visceral, and it attacks every area of life. It's physical, it's spiritual. There's very physical manifestations of this grief. There's famine. There's abuse. Society has fallen apart. But there's also spiritual grief in this. Worship is disrupted because the temple is gone. The prophets are waiting for God to answer, but God isn't answering. We see that in chapter 2, verse 9. No one's coming to the feasts. God has sent these terrible sufferings. Really, the biggest problem in Lamentations, there's really sort of 2 questions that the author has. First of all, does God love his people anymore? And secondly, yes, this punishment is deserved, but is it possible that maybe God has gone too far? Is it too much? There is some hope. Chapter 3 gives us this wonderful verse of hope that I've often seen taken out of context. Right in the very middle of this book of Lamentations, as they are crying out in the midst of the abuse and the suffering, I mean, the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem. And in the middle of that, you get this beautiful passage in chapter 3. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of Yahweh's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. In fact, that old hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness, comes from this passage. But this has got to be the most optimistic look at life ever, to say, well, it could be worse. You're looking at the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem. People are dead. Families have resorted to cannibalism. Priests are being killed in the temple. And at the end of the day, you look at that and you say, well, it could be worse. We're not all dead. That's something. So that's hopeful, but wow. I mean, that's really trying to spin a glass half full in this circumstance. The assumption all the way through is that God is king, and this punishment has come because the people have been disobedient. In fact, the lamenter here in Lamentations questions how much he should complain. In verse 39 of chapter 3, he says, why should the living complain when punished for their sin? There's this acknowledgement that, look, we did this. We are the ones who brought this kind of suffering on ourselves, and we really don't have anybody to blame but ourselves. So maybe we should just be quiet about that. But even though that sin is acknowledged, God is challenged to think about whether or not he's gone too far, whether or not this is too much. And in chapter 220, this is addressed to God. He says, look, Yahweh, and consider, whom have you ever treated like this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they've cared for? So should they resort to cannibalism? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Is this what should happen, God? I mean, I realize we're sinful. I realize we have problems, and I realize we shouldn't complain. But don't you think that maybe you might have gone a little bit too far? Perhaps the deepest fear of the singer of the Book of Lamentations comes at the very end, the very last verses of the book, where he says, restore us to yourself, Yahweh, that we might return. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. And he just leaves it there. This sort of open grief of maybe we went too far. Maybe it was too much. Maybe God has rejected us forever. Really, really gut-wrenching ending that you get to the Book of Lamentations. One of the fascinating things about this book to me, and the reason that I think you have to talk about it in a class when you're talking about poetic literature in the Old Testament, is the intensity and the disciplined nature of the expression of this grief. I mean, these intense feelings are almost raw, but whenever people express raw emotion, it's rarely as disciplined and ordered as this. I mean, this is an acrostic poem. The discipline required to write structured poetry and find the right words that completely walk you through the alphabet for 22 verses and 66 verses. I mean, acrostics, first of all, convey a sense of wholeness, right? There's that sense of A to Z, alpha, omega, complete run of the game. So this is a sense of wholeness, a completeness of grief. An ordered grief is what it's sometimes been called, which is fascinating to me. So you have these intense, raw emotions that are expressed in this very controlled, very ordered way. And then you come to chapter 5, which isn't there at all. And so some have suggested that ordered grief of the first 4 chapters has given way to a reminder that grief is truly chaotic, that the fact that we don't have that ordered expression on even though there's 22 verses, on the heels of this tremendously ordered expression, is a reminder, a re-entry of that chaos that grief always introduces, which is an interesting reading of just the poetics of that book as opposed to the terms of it. The book is read every 9th of Av. The Jewish calendar has the 9th of Av, which commemorates and remembers the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, both in 586, 587, and the burning of the Jerusalem temple in 70 by the Romans. And so Jewish tradition says both of those temple destructions occurred on the same day, and both of those are remembered on the 9th of Av, and both of them appropriately find some resonance with the Book of Lamentations, and as a result, it's read on those days.